All right, have everyone arrived in the back there? It's kind of hard to see, but I can see some familiar faces. Martin?
Hey, hey Martin.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Teodor.
I'm Matias.
And yeah, so how did we end up here, right? we sort of recently inherited a rather large application written in F#. And one of the first things that happened after we had inherited it was like somebody from the F# meetup community came and said, "Oh, how would you like to give a talk about F#?" And yeah, we were sort of like, "Oh, yeah, it would be very nice to give a talk, but we have experience with this system like a month, and we haven't written that much F#. You really sure you want to talk from us?" And they went, "Yeah, we want talks." Also, all right. So what do you suppose that we should talk about then? Yeah, we don't have this much experience. Well, you can just talk about inheriting a system. We haven't had a lot of talks about that. So I guess after some shin kicking and arm twisting from some people, you know who you are, we ended up here. So yeah, the outline for this talk is like we're going to try to give you some context to bring along on this journey, because like a good story isn't good if you know where it's set. And then we're going to try to dive into our personal inheritance story. And we're going to try to do that within a framework that sort of gives you a couple of tips on how you can make your newly written application a little bit easier for the next developer. And then finally, we're going to talk a bit about ownership and sort of reflect on whether or not we feel ownership of this application today. So those of you that have worked on the application we're going to talk about, this is hopefully the most interesting section for you. But all right, let's start with context. So where do we work? Well, we work at NRK. It's Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. And like we do television and radio and all those good stuff. And of course, we have a streaming service. You can't like produce video and not have a streaming service these days. And it's custom built in-house. We're very proud of it. And we're sort of working on a part of that big project. But you didn't come here to learn about NRK, although we're going to sneak a little bit of NRK into everything we do here. So let's move on to ourselves. I think in most talks, you don't really need to know a lot about those giving the presentation. But in this instance, it might actually be a point, because I mean, everybody's experience is going to be shaped by what they've done previously. So in order to understand why our experiences were the way they were, you probably need to know a little bit about our background before we started inheriting this application. So let's talk about me. It's my favorite talking point. I ended up being this kind of .NET enterprise guy. I didn't plan on it, and I guess some of my study mates have sort of might be quite surprised I ended up that way. But you start working, and .NET have all these nice features, and then you get paid a lot to work on like business critical applications, and they made it with .NET and Microsoft support and all that stuff. So in the new team that doesn't know my other background, they're sort of like, "Oh, Theodore, yeah, he's the guy that likes MSN and Microsoft Learning, and he probably reads all that stuff before he goes to bed." I've been F# curious for a while, and I've done a little bit at home and sort of like small projects at my previous place of employment, but never in the scale I do now at NRK. But Matias.
I'm Matias. I've been working at NRK for 2 years. Before that, I worked with a power analysis tool written in Python. So I hadn't touched .NET before that. So switching to F# was okay, because it has at least less brackets than C#. So
probably the .NET language that looks most like Python, yeah. And we think that we might represent two archetypes that move into F#. So like the .NET developer that's done a lot of C# but not a lot of F#, and the developer that hasn't done a lot of .NET at all but finds F# to be a curious language.
So it wouldn't be nice to tell you a story without giving you the context. It would be like telling you a fairy tale while you assuming it was a sci-fi thriller or something. So Personalization, the application we're working with, that we inherited, is all about you. It's a system that handles personalization in NRK TV and NRK Radio. So what do you mean when we talk about personalization?
Yeah, it's a really broad topic, and I don't think we can say that we handle the entire problem of personalization at NRK, but we do a slice of it. And of course, recommendations, for instance, is a personalized service that doesn't fall under our umbrella. But we're going to talk mainly about two features that are sort of our bread and butter. And that's our favorites. So if you like a particular show or a standalone program or a radio program or a podcast, you can put a favorite star on it, and then you'll get that presented to you much further up, so you can find your favorites easier when you log on. We also do consumption, and the idea by tracking consumption is that when you wake up in the morning and press play on the newest news show, and then you make yourself breakfast, and then you finish your breakfast, the show is half played, you move along, you go on the bus, you open your mobile phone, you press play again, then we know that you left off at that point, and we can start and pick up the playback from the same point. So you don't need to seek forward and backwards. And all these features are only for logged-in users. So if you don't have an NRK account yet, please create an NRK account. But yes, there are some consequences of this functionality being sort of personalized. And can you tell me more about them?
So functionality for each user is separate and independent from another. So there's no shared state between the users. And we need to handle things pretty quickly when someone asks for their favorite shows or how long they have come in a certain episode. So also an error can be isolated too and only affect one user. And boy, we do care that stuff works at NRK. So we have divided each service in different colors. We have red, that is very essential. And we have yellow, that is somewhat essential. And we have green, that is nice to have features. And the archetypical red service is typical the front page or playback. You expect to play episodes and movies at NRK. If that don't work, something is deeply wrong.
People tend to complain if their news television program doesn't work. And especially when stuff happens in the world, it's, yeah, it must work. It's a red service.
Yeah, so PS personalization is a green service. Lucky for us, it's a nice to have feature.
And we do think that inheriting a nice to have feature service makes things a lot easier for new developers. I mean, sort of when we had to get over the hurdle of doing the first deployment, it wasn't that hard because we knew even if we break stuff, it's not going to be like a massive failure on NRK's part. So maybe inheriting green systems are a bit easier than inheriting a red system.
So let's also have a quick look at the traffic in PS personalization. Even though we're only serving authenticated users, we are having a lot of traffic, between 50 and 80 million requests every day. The majority of requests are progress reports. So when people use NRK TV or radio, we want the users to register progress at least every 30 seconds, but also at pause and play and skip. So during the day, that will get a lot of traffic.
So whenever you press play on NRK, please think of us. We think a lot about you when you press play.
So let's look at the average workday. I like to think of it as it starts at 6 a.m. and up to a peak at around almost 8. People are going to the jobs. They're getting updated on the recent news, listening to podcasts.
I do think you're a bit optimistic.
Okay.
So I remember we took a look, and it's like mostly children's television programming at the start of the day.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe some people are using NRK like daycare service. I guess daycare is sort of a public health kind of thing in Norway. So yeah, public service.
That makes sense. And if you look at the average Sunday, we can see that the local peak starts about the same time, but it lasts longer during the day. And it also gets a peak around the evening. The average Sunday gets around 1,700 requests per second. And a little bit about the big date in PS personalization. Easter Sunday 2022 was the day with the most traffic. We had almost 2,100 requests per second. Yeah, so it was like a regular Sunday, but on speed.
I guess Easter is a big time of year for us. Sort of the best mix of people staying at home and people wanting to watch stuff and all those good things.
And also a small curiosity, around 7 o'clock, there's a small dip in traffic. That means people are going from on-demand streaming to live streaming. We don't get any traffic from the live streaming service.
Yeah, so we have a sort of a hallmark in every Norwegian home is actually turning on old-style television and watching NRK news at 7 o'clock.
Dagsrevyen.
But at some point, we'll turn off a regular TV and only get everyone in on video on demand.
And finally, there's a big difference between the minimum and maximum in traffic here, so a scalable system would be nice. But you're probably dying to learn something about inheriting applications, so
let's talk about inheriting an application then. So before we're going through this section with some small stories about our experience of inheriting PS personalization, we thought we wanted to give you sort of a mental image and framework for thinking about how applications are experienced by the next developer. So let's say you're the original developer, or you're a developer that's been there the most. You have this wide understanding of the entire application. You're able to see the entire horse and the background and the man on top. And of course you are, because you built most of it yourself. You raised that horse from it was little. You probably are the guy on top. And you might have even built the buildings in the background. And the thing to remember is that people inheriting applications, they don't view them like this. They're not going to see the entire horse. What they're going to see is only a slight part of it. Like when you're inheriting stuff, you view it through this tiny peephole from, it's like being in one room and standing on one side, trying to look through the keyhole in a door into another room and finding out whether or not there is a horse or a donkey in the other room. It's pretty hard. But if you keep this mental image in the back of your mind as you develop, you can use this understanding in order to facilitate that kind of viewing of code better. So we have picked out 3 tips that we hope are going to be beneficial for everybody writing software that they actually want somebody else to maintain later. So let's start off with the first tip. The first tip is sort of like sidestepping the entire problem. As long as you're able to put code and other important stuff within the same cone of vision, then there's no problem. You can work with that without understanding anything else. The only problem is, like if you want your software to do anything interesting, it's really hard to only write software that works this way. Because in order for some tiny piece to do something interesting, it usually has to communicate with the entire whole. But there are a lot of techniques you can use to make things a little bit easier, like trying to put stuff that changes together in the same place, spending time on folder structure and naming and sort of trying to guide the developer in the right way and feel that they are the same place when they work with the same sort of related things. But it's simple in principle, but it's really hard to do in practice. So we're going to go through some examples that we've seen in PS personalization, starting off with our domain model.
So here we have an example of discriminated union. So you learn a lot about the domain when you're reading the code for this one. In this example, I learned a lot about what you can favorize in NRK TV and radio. So here you can see that you can favorize a TV series, a radio series, podcast series, TV standalone program, and radio standalone program. So Fortunately, having a concise typed domain model helps a lot keeping important stuff in view.
And I mean, the first time I saw this, I was like, why are TV series not just a list of standalone programs? Why is this a separate concept? This makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
But you explained it.
Yeah, and what we learned was TV standalone program is just a fancy word for a movie or a documentary.
Yes,
So-
with something completely different entirely. So, although things in the main model might look really strange at first glance, it's usually the start of a good story. So I sort of envision everyone at NRK going down to Colosseum like a movie theater, and they'd be like, oh, let's go to the single standalone TV program theater, and let's buy tickets for this next big standalone program. It's going to be great. And as an aside, our domain model and actually most of the code we have written are written in Norwegian. And at least for the main model, we have found that to be beneficial. It makes it a lot easier to communicate with non-programmers or people not sort of into that slice of code. And when you hear other people talking about stuff that is related to the stuff you're working on, it's a lot easier to relate. The same words get used over and over again. And I mean, here in Norway, we like to think that we are really good at speaking English and understanding English. And I guess we are, but as we most definitely felt while preparing for this talk, it's sort of a big gap from a native speaker to a Norwegian English speaker. So you don't need to make your job harder if you don't have to. At NRK, it's a Norwegian working language. We can use Norwegian, and the concepts are Norwegian. So yeah, don't be afraid of using Norwegian in your code.
Yeah, and the code is not only in Norwegian, we also have Norwegian dialects. So some parts of the code is written in trøndersk, so we have modelltester og
Modelltester og radiostyrt, ja. And we tend to joke that that's because since NRK have to produce stuff in both in several written versions of Norwegian, this is sort of our district mandatory distributed language Norwegian dialect part. We should probably have some Sami there as well.
Yeah, and in the beginning, your vision of the functionality that the application provides is also limited. So therefore, it's a lot easier to start working on feature that has a limited functional scope. So when I started working with pest personalization, my first feature was to move database level serialization to protobuf. That was hard because you needed to know a lot about the domain and touch almost the whole code base.
Is this thing going to be serialized to the database? Yes, it is. And you can ask that question again and again throughout the code base.
Yeah, and the other functionality I was part of to made was radio clip. It had a much more limited scope.
So I didn't feel anything about these problems because I arrived in November. And in November, I got the story from Geir. We're starting up doing push notification. It's this kind of separate thing on the side. You don't need to learn a lot about the other stuff. And it's been smooth sailing ever since. I guess the drawback is that I only know about push notifications now. But I know them very well. Yes. So what do you do when you can't keep everything in view? Well, there are several things you can do, and one of them is to think of your code base as being a mountain landscape with high peaks and dangerous streams and other things, places where things could go awry. And like when you're going from a hut to another hut, there might be a path, and along the way, you probably want some signs to tell you that you're heading in the right direction. So we want to make the case that using signposting in your code could be a good thing in order to help the next developer. So you can signpost in a lot of ways. One of the more simple ways of doing it is just to write some good comments. And that's an easy thing to say, but it's really hard to do in practice. So with a comment or two, you can sort of hint that, all right, if you change this piece of code, you should probably also be looking in this other place of the code base. And by doing that, you can give people a little heads up that there are more pieces to the puzzle than the one you're currently viewing. And we felt we had done a good job at this. Here is an example from push notifications. So due to constraints, and let's leave it at constraints, we ended up with saying that, all right, when you first use push notifications, we don't want to enable it by default that you get stuff pushed out to you. So we want sort of the default initialized value to be false. And we have that 2 places in the code. So there's like the main place, and there's this little place on the side where you need it because architecture and reasons. Well, we're going to fix it. We're going to put up this nice big sign saying that if you change this value, you need to look in this other place as well. And we were very happy with ourselves. And we even said like, all right, we're going to try to break this now before the talk so we can see how it breaks and we can make other cool slides showing this story. The only problem is that we realized we put this sign on the wrong end. It's not at the start of the journey, it's at the destination. So when you change this, you go to the other place, you don't know about this sign at all, you change it. But then hopefully the other mechanism for doing signposting kicks in, your test suite, right? It should probably check for these kinds of inconsistencies. So we got a test failure, and it looks really good up on the slide, like, yeah, it's, do you have push notifications enabled? No, you don't have, but it should be that you have it. The only problem here is like, the output is, you have a mismatching DTO error. So the failure message itself doesn't really tell you anything about what you've done wrong. It's not like, it's a mismatch between 2 initializations. It's like, this value has changed and it's not the same as it used to be. So we go into the test suite and you look at that and say, of course it has changed. I just changed it. I should probably update all the tests. So then you go through all the tests and you update it, and
success.
Yeah, it works.
All green tests without changing the destination.
Yeah. So signposting can be very hard, and comments can be good, and tests can be good, but it's hard to getting them right. And I hope our story can be an inspiration. And probably trying to break it is the way to discover whether or not you've done it the correct way or not. And let's talk more about comments. So, how many here actually like using documentation comments? Yeah, great. No, you don't like it, otherwise. My guess is like, I really love them. It's like, is there a way to write comments that is even better than writing regular comments? Wow. But my guess is that it's sort of the most untrendy language feature that somebody's going to evangelize at NDC this year. I hope so. But like, they're really great, and I get why most people hate them, because they can be rather large and take focus away from your code. And somebody has probably worked at a place where it's like, it's mandatory to do documentation comments on any public anything, anywhere. And then you get like these auto-generated documentation comments which says like things, name, gets name, returns, name, and parameters, none. Return value, string. Yeah. So like any tool, if you do bad stuff with it, the result is going to be bad. I mean, I do think that if you're using documentation comments to sort of describe the themes in your application and you spend a little bit of time on getting them good, they can be a lot better than regular comments. Again, because you can view them from both sides. The side can be available at both the start of the journey and the destination at the same time. And you can get compiler support like, I'm referencing this type that you should look at, and it has changed the name. And then the compiler actually knows that, this is a type reference and I should update and warn you about that. And you can do hypertext linking and examples and more, and use documentation comments. All right, I'll stop now.
And having a complaining compiler can also be an advantage. It's like this F# programmer's pathfinder. So here we're looking at the example where we use the discriminate union type from before. We are not using the radio series field. So the compiler complains.
we've forgotten about radio. And that's sort of quite usual for me and Matias, because we're 4 people in the team, and 2 of them are sort of radio persons, and 2 of them are TV persons. So whenever we do stuff, we tend to break the radio stuff.
Yeah, so using the compiler means it's easier to locate where you need to update the code, and it also makes you more confident that you did it right, and you avoid a lot of the usual bugs. So furthermore, it makes you take an active approach to error handling. For example, if you use a result type, if you handle the OK result type, you also need to handle the error result type. So what to do when an error occurs. So if you want to log the error or do something else, you need to handle it.
And what we're hinting at here is that F# has a lot of nice features that can make you write code bases where less stuff is allowed. And when less stuff is allowed, even us typing randomly at this application we doesn't understand tend to produce more working code than if more things are allowed. It's a bit like eating vegetables. You might be complaining when you're stuck there for the 5th or 6th hour on the same compiler error, but in the long run, it's probably good for you, and you'll lead a more healthy and stress-free life.
And now we've shown you a couple of ways to signpost your code. A lot more exist, so be creative with your signposting, but don't overdo it, because too much signposting obscures what's important.
All right, let's move over to the 3rd and final tip. So you can do signposting, but when you walk in the mountains, you usually have a map as well. And drawing maps is a nice thing to do about code bases and application features and other stuff as well. And the important thing to have in mind here is like a map is a way to communicate some kind of concept. And it's always going to be a simplification of what you're trying to describe. And in order to make that simplification, you have to prioritize. You want to show the important stuff, but you have to leave out the stuff that's not important. And making that decision and actually managing to focus on the important stuff, it can be hard. But it's like, if I want to go on a trip and I need to know if it's a steep mountainside or a flat mountainside, I need a topological map. If I want to know about the rain at certain areas, I need a meteorological map. If I want to know where this talk is, I probably need the NDC agenda and a plan of this building. And if you use the wrong kind of map to try to communicate another kind of concept, you always end up with problems. But one of the easiest way of making a map is to write documentation. I guess a theme for me this talk is like the less code and more words you write, the better it is. But writing documentation can be really good. And the nice thing about using like such plain building blocks as text and images is that they are infinitely adaptable. If you want to communicate like an abstract feeling of loneliness, you can certainly do that with words and images. It's not usually done in documentation, but I've seen other people do it. And again, if you want to like underline, oh, this domain concept, it's used in this kind of way, all these things you can fit your text and images into. The drawback, of course, is that it's usually totally separate from the code. And you have to remember to update it. And it takes a lot of time to write. And actually writing text that communicates a complex concept efficiently is rather hard. So yeah, we have had experiences with this in PS personalization as well. The first experience usually is, oh, you have documentation. And that's a good experience. Mm-hmm. The next experience then usually is, oh, yeah, this is not that up to date, is it? And to be fair, PS personalization isn't that bad, but it's still like, yeah, some parts of it isn't that up to date. And I heard you told me that you worked a little bit on it.
The documentation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I arrived after Matias, so I guess I benefited from your updates. And yeah, and the experience have been like, all right, if we have documentation that's not up to date, maybe we have too much documentation covering not the important stuff. We should cut them out of documentation and really focus on only keeping this lean set of documentation up to date. And that's one idea, but in the next, around the next bend, you see like, oh, this concept is rather important. We should probably have documented this. And then it's not documented. And this leads you down to thinking, all right, we should write more documentation. So I guess the sum for us at least is there's no winning in documentation. There's only a grind, and you can only strive to do it the best to your ability. But what you do when written documentation isn't enough?
You turn to living documentation. So people can be great documentation because they can adjust how they communicate concepts on the fly, so it fits your current needs. So being in a programming mob is great for this, since you're always supported by your fellow teammates. In PS personalization, we do a lot of code work in mobs, and that works great for us.
And being at an organization where you can actually work together as a team in that way, where you're not sort of just thrown a project like, yeah, from 2 years ago, somebody made this thing and we want you to update it. Being a place where like you have long-lived teams and where people actually value communication as part of the development process is really nice. And I think it's one of the keys that, one of the reasons that we felt we came into and learned PS personalization as fast as we did. I know not everybody has that kind of context where they work, but we still think that's one possible key to success where you're doing long-lived systems and want them to be alive after the first developer left the building.
So for me, it was great to have the programming mob to get to know the domain model, the F# language, and .NET in general. So we talked a bit about F# already, but now we want to focus on the experience using F# in a production system. So before we started at NRK and PS personalization, and we heard that it was written in F#, we thought it was going to be monads everywhere. It would be crazy custom computational expressions and peculiar point-free programming, but it wasn't the case. You see the code in reality here. This is code that you have seen every other place, written in any other language. So I was both disappointed and relieved.
I mean, you sort of expect to become a part of this select group that understands category theory. And then you open the application and it's like, yeah, it's some asynchronous stuff because we're calling other APIs. And then there's a lot of match statements. So we tried to make the joke that, have you seen the meme where there's a guy standing and there's a lot of if statements? And he's wondering like, oh, is this artificial intelligence or machine learning? And I guess our version of this would be like a bunch of match statements and like, oh yeah, is this functional programming?
Yeah, and you can probably build production-grade F# with more advanced functional programming concepts. But if you do, you have to be precise and keep things understandable if you do so.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about .NET and F#. So I don't think we feel like insiders in the F# community yet. That probably come sometime. But as a sort of an outside view into the F# and .NET community, it sort of feels like F# and .NET has this love-hate relationship. Like one loves to be a functional language part of this big ecosystem where you can find a lot of stuff and you can get a lot of support and you can run your stuff anywhere without too much hassle. But at the same time, it's like, oh, Microsoft, do you actually care about F#? Or is it just another language out there? Are you going to push features to it? And you can sort of feel like, depending on which person you talk to, there's a sort of a different feeling about this topic, I think. So this is just a rundown of our experience. And our experience been that, oh, it's mostly quite easy to use .NET stuff, like standard library things and a lot of other interfaces is like plug and play. You write F# code for it and it works out of the box. And F# itself has a lot of nice language features that can be used in order to interrupt with code that isn't really written in a functional F# way. Like you have classes and you can do all the same things that you do in C#. So if you need like a special feature to interrupt with a library that's mostly written with C# in mind, it usually works out okay. You don't always end up with the F# code you would have liked to have written, but it's not like a huge amount of code, and you can usually abstract it away in an okay way. And it's not just the stuff that you get in the framework that's good. There's also a lot of goodies in the F# community. So like you can find packages that wraps, let's say, interesting .NET APIs in nicer to use F# ways. And you can also find a lot of things like Giraffe. We use Giraffe a lot in order to build small APIs. And in addition to the stuff that's sort of nice, makes the .NET ecosystem nice to use, there are also a lot of stuff that's just special for F# or F# made, like property-based testing suites like fscheck, which is a really nice testing suite that can be used in C# as well, but it's sort of built by the F# community. And parser combinator libraries and all other kinds of special goodies. And the F# community seems to be quite out there and hard-working. Sometimes there might be a feeling that they would love to have a couple of extra hands. Like I use Ionide with VS Code a lot. And I see that every time Microsoft does a huge update on the .NET framework, they have a lot of work to do. And they would probably love to be another couple of hands. So fingers crossed that we can be a couple of hands in some years.
If you don't switch to Rider like the other of us.
No, no, Rider.
Yep.
Yeah, but there's bad stuff as well. And I think the place where we mostly feel like that mostly grinds our gears right now is when we're using the Azure SDKs. Not every one of them are sort of hard to use from F#, but some of them certainly are. And you kind of get the feeling that, all right, maybe they didn't intentionally try to make it hard to use from F#, but they certainly didn't succeed making it easy either. At the moment, we're trying to swap up to the new table storage library, like Azure Data Tables. And implementing this iTable entity interface in F#, it's really, really bad. Vincent knows what I'm talking about. And that's a sad story, actually, because I think F# is the only like big Hindley-Milner strongly typed programming language that could be part of this giant cloud enterprise thing. And although I know that not everybody is sort of excited about enterprise programming, it pays bills. And if we could do functional programming to pay the bills, it would be really nice. So fingers crossed there will be better F# support in the Azure SDK going forward. And on to our final section. So we hinted at the start that we were going to speak about ownership. And we wanted to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say ownership. So ownership could be that your manager arrives one day and says, "Hi, Matias. Have you seen this code base? It's rather large. And you know Johan, he just left for another company." What you say, "You own this now?" Yes, sounds good.
Of course.
That's one level of ownership, the sort of the mandatory organizational hierarchy directed ownership model. But that's not the kind of ownership that we're after. We're sort of seeking the kind of ownership where you engage with the application you're working on, where you feel that you actually care about the functionality and you care about how this application's functionality might be extended or might not be extended if it's not something that's fitting, where you actually care about the architectural decisions that are made in the code. And when you find some code that you don't like, it's not like, "Oh, this is the bad code that some previous developer wrote," but more like, "Oh, this is the code I haven't refactored yet." So we want to reach this code, this level of ownership because it makes it a lot more fun to work with the stuff we do. And also we think we're able to do a much better job when we have reached this level of ownership. And we have a test that you can apply to your own projects in order to find out if you reached what we called true ownership. And the test is to ask yourself, whenever somebody complains about your system, is your response, "Yeah, the previous developer was really not that good"? If that's your response, you probably not reached true ownership yet. If you feel that, all right, yeah, I can see your problem, and I feel that I own the solution and the application that needs to change to do this, then you're probably at a better place. So we want to go through the entire stack of PS personalization and say a little bit about how we feel that we own each part. And this is the point I hope where previous developers are sort of curious to see.
Terrified.
We'll see. Will be nice. Let's start with
the functionality. So the functionality is easy to understand, is easy to own. In PS personalization, we have progress and we have favorites. If you favorize a TV series, it will pop up in your content on the front page. And if that doesn't work, something is wrong, and we have ownership enough to deal with it. Something has to be done.
We have become those people that go to family gatherings and say like, "Hi, Grandma, have you logged on to NRK yet? Oh, you really should. Let's do it together." And while we're logged in, have you tried pressing the star? Yes, do press the star. On every show, Norge Rundt, absolutely press the star. And when it comes to the code and architecture, it's a bit up and down. Parts of it we do truly feel that we own, like the domain model. We might not agree with every design choice made, but like the whole concept of it, and that this is a piece of code that we have to live with and learn and experience together going forward, we feel sort of really bought into that thing. The same is to go along with PS personalization. It's built with an actor framework called Orleans. And I'm not going to talk a lot about actor frameworks, but the architectural decision on a base level in PS personalization is to say that a user and a user's kind of things, like a favorite, can be thought of like an actor. And that kind of model also resonates a lot with us, because the actor model has a lot going for it when it comes to separate things that can be kept separate. And the functional domain that we're working in also has a lot of stuff that can be kept separate. But there are stuff we're not that fan of as well. And I talked a little bit about FS-Check, this property-based testing framework. And property-based testing is cool. And FS-Check is cool. But like 200-line model-based, property-based tests are not that cool. They have probably grown and grown and grown. And whenever they fail, it's like either Geir, which is back there somewhere, yeah, he knows how to fix them. But Matias, we talked about it. We tend to like try to rebuild and rerun and hope for the best.
2 reruns is always enough. So
yeah, 2 reruns and then you're green. We should probably look into that sometime in the future.
Yeah. And monitoring is maybe the hardest part to have ownership about. We have alarms popping up from time to time. And we also have a dashboard, but when a new exception arises or it's a spike in the dashboard, we don't know if it's something we can deal with next week or something we need to do now. So, because one of the previous developers can say that, oh, that's something we see from time to time. It's not that hard. So
and it's pretty understandable to see how you end up this way, because you develop a system and then you're going to put it into production. So you want to graph out a lot of stuff about this application because you want to know how it performs. And you don't really know perhaps what's going to be important and what's not going to be important. But like, you know how the application works, you know all the details from it. So having a huge board of metrics is good. And then you deploy it and you find some anomalies. Yeah, the stuff where the line goes across the and the stuff where it shouldn't go above. You find those places and you put up some alarms. And you don't need anything else because you know all the things. So when something pops up, no problem.
Yeah, and when inheriting the application, we wanted to own the monitoring because it's important, but it was difficult.
And we hope that the thoughts around SRE, like site reliability engineering, might improve these kinds of things. So SRE contains a lot of stuff about actionable alerts, making an alert actionable for somebody who hasn't worked on that application before. And there's a lot of stuff about doing smart notifications that you get from trends rather than just crossing a limit one time. All right. So when we sort of were near the completion of our slide deck, we sat down and thought like, ownership. Why do we feel differently about ownership in the different places of the application? Why do we love the functionality so much and loathe the monitoring? And to us, it came down to ownership, so understanding. So the pieces of the code that we understand or that taught us an important lesson, we feel strongly connected to those. We feel that we own those parts of the code. And those things that we don't understand, we feel sort of like, oh, this is not my plate. I don't understand this thing. And I think you can't expect to build a system where everything is instantly understandable because you want the next developer to own it. What you got to think about is like, okay, but maybe I can make the most important pieces understandable because then I know that the ownership and maintenance will come even though I'm not able to give the best kind of handover to the next developer. So think about ownership ownership and how it relates to understanding is sort of our finishing point here.
So inheriting a large F# application went pretty okay. We have delivered new stuff to production without breaking it
That often?
that often. We didn't need to call back Frida and Geir from parental leave this spring. And I hope that I don't be called back either in November when I leave for parental leave.
But you know, Matias, sometime has to be the first to call back somebody from parental leave.
Aye, aye.
So, yeah, to sum up, yes, you're going to inherit an F# application. It can actually be quite an enjoyable experience. And it was that for us. And we do think it is because the application we inherited had some stuff going for it. A lot of stuff was sort of like contained within small nuggets of functionality. And F# certainly could help with that, especially in the domain model. And those places where it wasn't put together, well, maybe there wasn't that much signposting, but we had great maps working in a mob. And then, again, this sort of illustrates that you don't have to write F# that's crazy hard, even for people that doesn't know a lot of F# from before. So we do think that F# doesn't have to be really hard for new developers. And finally, again, if you make somebody understand something, they will feel ownership for it. So I think it's only 1 point left. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Is it large? Is it number of lines of code?
We haven't counted the number of lines of code, so unfortunately we can't give a good answer there.
What can you give, like, ballpark? Is it 1,000, 10,000, 100,000?
Maybe it's between 10,000 and 100.
Yeah, I can give one estimate. So when I first loaded it into Ionide, like the entire solution, it wouldn't load into Ionide in VS Code. So I had to manually go in and build each separate sub-application in order to get built, not executable, like assemblies. So the main process, when you loaded the entire solution, wouldn't time out. So it's at least big enough to cause trouble to at least simpler editing and highlighting software.
Yeah, you said there were problems using some different libraries, which were obviously designed for C#. So what's the reason for sticking with F# for those problems when it's really easy to interrupt between C# and F#?
Ooh, great question. So I think you can either say that, previously I built a system, a rather smaller one, but also like a production system that used that strategy to interface with the world around it. So it was like, when we were going to the database, there was this small C# shim, and the C# code was written in a way that was targeting F#. So it was mainly using models from an F# assembly and so on and so on. And that worked out okay, but a nice thing about F# is that you can so easily use result types and those kind of things that sort of fits very well with the borders of your application environment. So even though you might have to write a little piece of code that is not optimal, the stuff you get after it when it's F# the entire way can be pretty good. Was that an answer?
Yeah.
Yep. Any other questions? Yeah, Ingvar.
You talk about mob programming. Could you tell, how do you do that? Do you have any practice on doing it?
Yeah. Do you want to take this?
Yeah, we sit together almost from the morning on and solve different problems. We prioritize tasks together and solve them and discuss architecture and code, writing code and writing the tests as well. So.
And then we sit down with not one computer because we're all really individualistic. So everybody wants their own keyboard and mouse and stuff. So we put on a timer, and then I start for 10 minutes. And when my 10 minutes are up, there might be Matias. And Matias doesn't want to use my keyboard, and I doesn't want to use his. So we move along to his computer. And then we move along to Frida's computer and Gei's computer. And then we're back at my computer where I can finally use my nice keyboard. Any other questions? All right. If
One more question. Back there.
I'll just stand up.
Yeah.
From your perspective of like a new developer starting on a large project with a language you recently haven't worked with, what would you recommend like starting with to get quickly like familiar with the project?
A mob programming task with a limited scope would be fine to just keep to start with the domain model, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good sum up as well. If the team that you're becoming a part of has sort of some self-contained tasks, and they are able to dedicate the resources, or well, we don't really think that way because we think that mob programming actually makes you work faster. But that's a long story we're not going to cover here. But if you're able to work on that limited piece of functionality along with another developer, there's probably not any faster ways to get into the code base, in our view.
More questions?
Well, so you say that you inherited this code base, right? What happened to the previous devs on the code base? Did they leave or die? Or
They're all dead, Jim. No, actually, it's a very good question because in a team where you work as a mob, people might change jobs and go away, but you don't ever really end up in the situation where you're just stuck with something and there's nobody there. I think the way we felt that nobody was there was when people were on parental leave. Then we were sort of stuck without the støttehjul. But yeah, the way you work sort of, it really impacts if there's a big inheritance or a small one. Or you should maybe turn it around because big inheritance is good, but not in software. I think we're sort of running close to our end on time here. If you have other questions, we're going to be at the NRK stand down on the floor. Just pop by and say hello. You can also just send us a tweet if you have something you think about later. Fire away. And I think that's all for now. Thank you very much all for coming.